Hello and welcome to Space Talk with the American Astronautical Society. I am Dr. Amir Gohardani, the host of Space Talk and the editor-in-chief of Space Times. And today I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming Dr. John O'Meara, Chief Scientist and Deputy Director of Keck Observatory in Hawaii. The topic of our talk is the Next Great Space Observatory. Welcome to the session, Dr. O'Meara.
Well, thanks very much, Amir. I really appreciate the invitation, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much. From how much I know that there are some telescopes in Hawaii. And I was just intrigued by this topic, the Next Great Space Observatory. So I'm very curious to see and find out if that observatory will be in Hawaii or somewhere else. So with that premise, I ask you to please share a little bit about your educational background and
Sure.
a little bit about your role.
Sure thing. So, as you said, my name is John O'Meara. I'm the Chief Scientist and Deputy Director at the Keck Observatory, and I'll talk about the observatory in a minute. So in terms of my educational background, I was trained primarily in physics. So I got my undergraduate degree from the University of Washington physics, and then went to the University of California, San Diego, with the intent to get a degree in physics. But whilst there, I used a telescope, and the very first telescope I ever used was the Keck 1 telescope, which was the most powerful telescope on the planet. And so I got hooked, switched to astronomy and astrophysics, got my PhD in astrophysics from UCSD, went to MIT as a postdoc, a brief teaching stint at Penn State University, and then for 10 years, I was a professor at a liberal arts college in Vermont. So a tiny liberal arts college called St. Michael's College up in Vermont. But it was then that I started to get really involved with a number of ideas for mission concept development and also in space policy. So I worked a lot on Capitol Hill and then became involved with some new and exciting projects at NASA, which is how I got involved in some of the things we'll talk about later. And then the opportunity arose to become the chief scientist at the Keck Observatory, which I applied for, and for some silly reason they hired me. And I've been doing that for 5 years, and I became the deputy director there at Keck about 2.5 years ago. So it's been a long and interesting journey, and maybe we can talk a little bit later about how somebody becomes a chief scientist or a deputy director or any of those things, what that means. But it's been a winding road and a lot of fun along the way.
Surely, it's an intriguing, career that you had so far, and I'm really happy to hear that you actually had so many different roles prior to the ones that you have right now. Wonderful. So I can't wait to hear more about the observatory and all those observations you've done, particularly when it comes to space. So let's move into that direction now, if you are okay with that.
Sure thing. All right. Before I launch into the Next Great Space Observatory, I did want to tell you about the greatest ground-based observatory that I know of. It's the one that I work at, the Keck Observatory, which is on the summit of Mauna Kea, along with 11 other observatories. It's one of the most powerful places on the planet to do ground-based astronomy, and the Keck telescopes are some of the most scientifically competitive ever constructed. So we've got a couple of Nobel Prizes under our belt and a number of other great awards along the way, and a very, very impactful scientific career over 30 years of science observations. You can see the two telescopes here on a night of observing. That's not CGI. Those are real lasers that we use for what we call adaptive optics to try to minimize the effects of the blurring of the atmosphere. And we can talk about that later if you like. And, Keck's superpower, and if you follow space astronomy, is that it's a very, very large mirror. It's 10 meters across, the largest optical infrared telescope in the world that's fully steerable. And if you look at it in detail, it reminds you a lot of the James Webb Space Telescope. And James Webb got a lot of its design heritage and a lot of the other heritage about how it does some of the optical measurements that it does from Keck. Many of the same optical engineers helped build the Keck Observatory and then went later on to work at Webb. In fact, if you just take that outer ring of segments out, it's almost exactly the same size and distribution of segments on there as Webb, except our mirrors are coated in aluminum instead of gold because we're not operating at the infrared wavelength that Webb is operating.
So thank you for pointing that out. Earlier in Space Talk, we actually had a NASA scientist talk about the James Webb Space Telescope. And I just have to ask you this question.
Mm-hmm.
With regards to, given the similar designs that you pointed to, with regards to the land-based observation points and the telescopes we have and the ones in space, what's really the difference? Can you talk to us a little bit about that, please?
It's a great question. It's an important question because, we invest a lot of resources, whether or not it's money or people or time, in all these facilities. And so it's important that all of them be uniquely capable in some ways. We don't want to duplicate effort. So the design similarities between, say, Keck and Webb are there, but fundamentally our telescope operates at different wavelengths than the Webb telescope does. We operate from the near ultraviolet all the way up through the near infrared. James Webb, on the other hand, operates out at farther wavelengths at the infrared out to the mid-infrared. And so wavelength complementarity is really important. The other thing is that we can change our instrumentation and our telescope all the time. The telescope, the main superstructure is the same, but our instrumentation has evolved over decades to incorporate new technologies. The way we operate the telescope has changed over time. And every day our crews go up and modify the telescope, whether or not it's the instrumentation, the optics, or whatever, to prepare for the nighttime observation. Extremely different from space, where basically the technology gets locked in oftentimes more than a decade in advance of launch. And with the exception of a serviceable telescope like Hubble, it's one and done. Whereas for something like Keck, we can constantly change the instrumentation. And that's a key capability, is for us to move along with the technology as it advances and move along with the science. But I tend to not think of these things as in competition. They're really, really collaborative. Oftentimes we will discover something and Webb will follow it up, or Hubble will follow it up, or Hubble or Webb will find something and we follow it up. And it's because we have those different capabilities. And right now, at least, this is still a larger telescope than Hubble and Webb. So it can do many things that the space telescopes can't. This telescope is 400 tons, whereas, and one of our instruments weighs about as much as the entire James Webb Space Telescope. So the fact that we don't have to launch it means that we can put a lot of interesting things on the telescope and capabilities that space telescopes currently can't imagine.
Wonderful. So a question that just popped into my mind as you were explaining this is, do you foresee the future telescopes in space to have that adaptability that you have with regards to instrumentation on Earth?
I do. And in fact, the telescope I'll talk about coming up has some of those aspects. But as we've seen, certainly just even in the last 10 years, the pace of technological development in space is extremely rapid. And as the cost per kilogram goes down to bring stuff up into low Earth orbit or even beyond, that's going to drive innovation in terms of the things that we can do once we're in orbit. So a lot of people like to think about in-space assembly of telescopes and other facilities. That's going to be a game changer once we figure out how to do it. But it turns out that the larger your telescope is, the more precise you have to know the figure of the mirror. And that's going to be a driving thing that makes in-space assembly difficult. But I have every confidence that over the next half century, certainly we're going to develop a lot of the key technologies to make very complicated structures in space, including space telescopes. But for the time being, we have to go with the technology that we know that we have at hand, because these are still multi-billion-dollar investments when we're talking about giant space telescopes.
Thank you for that answer.
So I'll switch gears here and ask if I were to try to summarize the entirety of my scientific journey in one question, it would be, how does the universe enable life? Oftentimes we talk too much about just the search for life in the cosmos, but it's a much more complicated story for that. If you consider the oxygen you're breathing right now, that has a history of over 13 billion years behind it. And so trying to figure out how the universe enabled life is a multifaceted thing, right? We want to understand how the first structures formed in the universe at the very violent early times when gravity and quantum mechanics were almost operating at the same level. And that left the imprints on the remainder of the universe for the rest of cosmic time. And then we need to understand how galaxies form, right? If you look at the Milky Way galaxy from afar, that would be that yellowish stuff in the middle. But it turns out the extent of the Milky Way is much, much farther beyond that in gas that we can't see at optical wavelengths. And we need to understand how that gas gets incorporated into the galaxy and forms stars. And it turns out we still don't really know how well stars form, right? Understanding how they go from that basic stuff that falls into the galaxies and forms is a critical part of understanding how eventually we're going to get solar systems, right? So zooming in, we need to understand how stars and the planets that are going to orbit them eventually form together out of this stuff. And then we need to understand the whole comparative exoplanetology. If you look just at our solar system, Mars is radically different from Uranus or Neptune. And the Earth is effectively unique with having a captured atmosphere and liquid oceans on the surface. So how is it that diversity of planets arise just within our solar system? And then how does that play out on the larger universal scale to understand the context where we are? And not just planets, right? This is the moon Enceladus, which is actively erupting geysers, and this was imaged by the Cassini mission. And it's a fair question to ask whether or not the conditions for life that exist on the Earth or existed on the Earth billions of years ago might exist in these places. And then finally, we want to search for living worlds. We want to find Earth-like planets around other stars that could hold an atmosphere and liquid water on the surface. So it's not just that final square that matters. It's the entire history that matters. And that's why we build the telescopes that we do. We build many, many, many telescopes, both on the ground and in space. But over the history of NASA, particularly since the early 90s to the current day, we built what we characterize as the great observatories, these massive Swiss Army knives in space that have fundamentally changed every aspect of the science that you've seen in the previous slide, right? Our mind easily goes to Hubble, the Hubble Space Telescope, probably the most famous telescope there is. And Hubble, over its 30 years, has really defined and redefined multiple times astronomy and astrophysics, but it's not alone. Right, it has an equivalent in the X-ray called the Chandra Space Telescope, which was launched a little bit after Hubble, and it has its equivalent in infrared, which was called Spitzer Space Telescope. Hubble and Chandra are still operating, but Spitzer was turned off a few years ago, basically because it ran out of cryogens. And there's also the James Webb Space Telescope, which launched on Christmas Day a couple of years ago, and has now taken its place as a great observatory. So these facilities, these are decades to build. These are billions of dollars to assemble, to integrate, to test, to launch. But these have also been some of the most impactful machines ever built by human beings in terms of trying to understand our cosmological history. And we're already well along the way in the next one, which is the Roman Space Telescope. It's what it's going to look like once it launches. Roman is basically the same size mirror as Hubble, and will look in near infrared and a little bit of optical light, but it will have 100 times the field of view of Hubble. In fact, if you want to think about how big Hubble's field of view is, get a dime out of your pocket and hold it at arm's length. And the patch on the sky that Hubble can see is about the size of Roosevelt's eye on the dime. So it's only a very, very small space on the sky. And for the kind of science that we need to be doing at Hubble kind of image resolution, we need a much bigger field of view. And that's what the Roman Space Telescope is going to be intended to do. It's going to be a giant survey telescope, but it's also going to be looking for planets around other stars. And it's going to be developing a key piece of technology that I'll mention in a bit. Right. So we've got the great observatories, and we've got the Roman Space Telescope, which should be launching around 2027. And it's starting to come, all the pieces are starting to come together at Goddard Space Flight Center. They're built all over the country, and in fact, all over the world, but they'll be integrated at Goddard for some of the final testing before being shipped to launch. And Roman is going to go out to L2, the Lagrange point 2, which is also where Webb is operating. But that observatory, as powerful as it's going to be, will not be able to answer some of the most fundamental questions we have about in trying to tell the story of life. In particular, how to observe a planet like the Earth around a sun like the star at a distance of tens of light years away. This is an exceedingly difficult technological challenge. Let me give you two reasons why. The first is, when things get far away, they appear closer and closer together, right? So, if you looked at the Earth around the sun from 30 light years away, for example, and you ask, how close does the Earth appear to the sun on the sky? The answer there is, it's about the width of a human hair held at arm's length if your arms are 200 meters long.
Wow.
So they're very, very, very close together in the sky.
Close, yeah.
And the only way you can disentangle those two things on the sky is to have a giant telescope. Turns out your ability to see things closer together is just a function of how big the mirror is. The other technological problem is the difference in brightness of those two things. If I place the Earth in orbit around the sun and I look at it from 30 light years away, the brightness of the sun is a factor of 10 billion times brighter than the reflected light off of the Earth. And why does that matter? Because it's the reflected light off of the Earth that we will take spectra of to understand whether or not the Earth has oceans and maybe the fingerprints of life in it, things we call biosignatures. So somehow we need to turn off the star by a factor of 10 billion. This is called coronagraphy, and it's one of the things that the Roman Space Telescope is going to be launching, a coronagraph that can do most of that, but is still about a factor of 100 too small. And so we need to be developing that technology. And those pieces, the technology that's needed, the stability and the size of a mirror, the coronagraph, and all of the other instrumentation that goes along with it, is going to be the mission of the next great observatory, which is called the Habitable Worlds Observatory. So a couple of things about it. It's a super Hubble, and what I mean by that is that it's going to cover the same wavelengths that Hubble can, the far ultraviolet to the near infrared, but it's going to have at least 8 times the collecting area. We don't know what the final architecture of the observatory is going to look like, but it is going to be massive. It is going to be as big as Webb or larger in its primary mirror. It will be serviceable at L2. Right? Instead of just taking it to L2, in the spirit of Hubble, we want to be able to upgrade the instrumentation over the decades as we learn about what the universe wants to be telling us. So we envision this as being an observatory that can live for decades and be upgraded along the way. We want to leverage modern heavy lift technology, right? We have a lot of technology coming along with Starship, with New Glenn, with SLS. That's going to allow us to put much more mass up there over to L2 than we currently can today. And we want to be built to extreme scientific tolerances. One of the things that I didn't mention yet about that primary mirror is not only does it need to be big, but it has to be extremely stable. You have to understand the stability of that mirror up to 1 part in about a millionth of the width of an atom, which is really, really technologically challenging. And that's going to be the main purpose of what we're going to need to explore with Habitable Worlds. It's important to emphasize that this is just a visualization. This is not what the observatory will look like. We don't know that yet. But it's going to have a large segmented mirror like Webb does. It has this big shroud on it because what we've learned from Webb at L2 is that micrometeorites can strike the primary mirror and represent a risk to the observatory. So we build a shroud around it to protect it. And then in the back is where the instruments will be loaded here that ideally we could have robotic servicing come up, swap them out over the lifetime of the observatory. You can ask me, how do you do that? And that's a really good question because we've never done it before. But we're already learning a lot about robotic servicing in low Earth orbit that we're then going to figure out how to do at L2.
Dr. Omer, I have a question regarding the Lagrange point 2
Yes.
that you mentioned a couple of times. And just for the interest of the general public, why L2?
Oh, this is a really important point. So we have, due to the way that gravity works, we have these things called Lagrange points, where if you were to ask about the balance of gravitational forces, there are the points where the pull due to the Earth from gravitational forces and the pull due to the sun cancel out. And so if you were to put something at the Lagrange point or in small halo orbit around it, it doesn't need fuel to stay in that orbit. And so that extends the lifetime of the mission. The Lagrange point 2, L2, was chosen because it can basically be in the shadow of the Earth and be very cold and looking away from the sun for long periods of time. That's why they chose it for James Webb, because it needs to be a very cold telescope. So the Lagrange points are ideal places to operate because they don't have the reflection of the Earth down below them like Hubble does, which can, drown out the signal that you need even during the nighttime because of what we call air glow. So you want to be far removed from the Earth's atmosphere, and L2 is really, really good for that.
And it's interesting you mentioned in orbit servicing, because obviously those type of solutions need to be developed to L2 for that to happen. And I understand that obviously we have at least some knowledge and expertise in low Earth orbit, but still going to be a maybe larger challenge to get to L2. But nevertheless, it's just points to how so many different technologies need to come together for making this work. And I'm very intrigued by the way you explain it. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think we're actually going to learn a lot as we construct Gateway. We've already learned a lot with Station, about the space station, about how to construct large things. Gateway is going to tell us how to do it far away, and then L2 is going to be it's going to be robotic, because I think the risk to human beings is probably a bit too large to go out to L2. But you never know, because again, the pace of technological change and the pace with which we understand how to live and work in space is just rapidly increasing. And so I'd be silly to say that 30 years from now we're not going to be servicing it. So you can ask, well, why would you build this thing? And it's going to be worth it. It's going to be worth it because here is the largest image the Hubble Space Telescope ever took. It was over 800 individual pointings of Hubble on the sky across the disk of the Andromeda galaxy. And it's a wonderful thing. If you look it up, you can zoom into this and see individual stars in Andromeda, which is unbelievable to me. But this took a long, long, long time, over 800 pointings. And if you were to build something like the Habitable Worlds Observatory, you can get that same result at either 8 times or more the speed. So it could take 8 times faster to go, which means you have more time to do other science. Or you can look at it for the same amount of time and go significantly deeper, see very, very faint objects inside of that. So that's the power of aperture. And what these orange squares show you is the individual pointings of something like the Habitable Worlds Observatory. So you get both a speed increase and a depth increase depending on how you want to do it. The other interesting thing here is that Hubble has ultraviolet instrumentation. It's the only great observatory currently that does. And over the course of its lifetime, Hubble has looked at a number of small spots inside of Andromeda in ultraviolet to understand the atomic physics of how star formation works and various other things. And that's these little dots here. It's a couple dozen over the entirety of the history of Hubble. And it's about 100 orbits worth of Hubble time to get that much. This is another superpower of the Habitable Worlds Observatory, because the Habitable Worlds Observatory will have multi-object spectrographs, not just one object at a time, but thousands at a time through an array of little shutters that can open and close above the detector, kind of like the pixels on your screen, but with little micro shutters. Though James Webb Space Telescope has this in the infrared. But it's going to do that in ultraviolet. So instead of having dozens, you'll have potentially millions of objects in the same amount of exposure time. So the multiplexing here, the huge gain in efficiency, but also in science that you get, because you can now look at the distribution of how stuff changes across galaxies, which is going to be really important. The other fun thing is the images you're going to get. So this is an image of Jupiter taken by the Juno Space Telescope, or the Juno mission, sorry, that's in orbit around Jupiter. Right now, Juno just got some really awesome images of Io, the big volcanic moon. But the Habitable Worlds Observatory will be able to make images almost this quality, but out at L2. And so that's a very powerful counterpart to missions that fly by or orbit things, because we'll be able to constantly monitor those things and try to understand those systems in different ways. But this is the big prize. So this is a simulation of what happens when you're able to turn off the sun, look at it from 33 light years away, and over years watch the solar system evolve. And if you see peeking out from behind the star, you can see Venus and the Earth. Why is Venus so much brighter? Because it's actually much more reflective than the Earth is at these wavelengths. But the point is that you can see the Earth at all. And if you can see the Earth, then that means you can image it. And that means you can also get a spectrum of the reflected light of its atmosphere. And if you were to be able to do that with the Habitable Worlds Observatory, you would see the presence of ozone, methane, oxygen, water vapor, carbon dioxide, and other things, which are the telltale fingerprints that the Earth is alive, and that has biology active on its surface. And that's what we really want to do. We want to be able to survey all of the stellar systems that could have planets in their habitable zone, look at their reflected light, and try to see whether or not some of those worlds have the fingerprints of life on them. And it's stunning to me to think that we can do this, right? When I was a kid growing up, there were 9 planets, and then we took away one of them. Since then, we're now at over 5,000 confirmed exoplanets. That's the world my children is growing up in. Not only do we know about exoplanets, but thousands of them. Once we launch a facility like this and operate it, my children's children are going to grow up knowing whether or not life is abundant in the universe. And that's just transformational from my perspective. That's why we invest billions of dollars. That's why so many thousands of people will put their lives into facilities like this. And it's why it's really exciting for me. So what's the near-term plan? And then we can have a conversation. The first is that we need to continue to identify the key science that drives the observatory so that we understand how that flows into what the architecture can be. And we need to flow these science yields through models to design the trade space. Does it mirror this big, this big? What is the configuration? What do the instruments look like? We need to identify and begin maturation of essential technologies that don't exist yet, but we know the path to them. And we need to advocate. This is an ultra marathon. It's going to take at least 15 years to build this thing and launch it. And that requires constant advocacy, both at Congress, in the public, amongst the science community, all of those things to make a vision for an observatory like this into reality. And, that's the plan. And that's what I'm part of right now for Habitable Worlds. And I guess I'm happy to talk about it.
Very, very interesting, Dr. O'Meara. I was blown away by the planning, really. I mean, just so many things that need to come together. I can just imagine the number of disciplines, also the subject matter experts that really need to be involved as part of this process. And as you very eloquently put it, it's not just about the scientific aspect, it's just the other aspect of awareness and getting funding and being able to do things in time for the next challenge, so to speak. So my question to you is, how far are we with regards to a lot of that? And I understand that, for instance, for the budgeting aspect, that can happen depending on, who's in the White House or the interest for the scientific journeys we have. But it's not only bounded to the United States, correct? It's more of a global scientific community. So if anything you can share regarding that would be great.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about there. The process by which we build these things is that every 10 years, the US astronomical community does the equivalent of a giant strategic plan. They call it the Decadal Survey. And the Decadal Survey makes recommendations of what are the key facilities we need to do and what are the key science questions we need to ask. And this is what many agencies, NASA and the National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy Office of Science, and Congress and presidential administrations use to guide where they want to put their resources. If it's not a big recommendation of this decadal survey, they probably don't want to invest billions of dollars in it. And so in 2020, the decadal survey convened, and then COVID slowed it down a little bit, but made the recommendation to build the facility that would eventually be called Habitable Worlds. Then the real planning begins. Like you said, we have to put together the very early work, and that's what I'm a part of, is the head of this science technology architecture review team, the co-chair of that. That's the very earliest stages of the plan. It's not even an official mission within NASA yet. We're developing all of the key questions that we need to ask scientifically and flow down before we can actually start the mission as an official project within NASA. And then it goes through the NASA mission formulation process, which is multiple decades. But as you said, it's an international venture as well. The European Space Agency, the Canadian Space Agency, the Japanese Space Agency, many other agencies eventually will be heavily involved in this, in the same way that Webb is an international, in the same way that Hubble is international. And so that's a really key point, is understanding that this is a global mission. Only the United States could lead a mission like this, but it requires participation by the whole world, because its science is also for the whole world. And also, like you said, the number of disciplines that go into building a mission like this is huge. The scientific aspects of it really get going in a big way once the mission is launched. But leading up to that, yes, it's guided by the science questions that we have, but it is a huge engineering enterprise. It is a huge communications enterprise. We have to have communications professionals to constantly keep the message there. It is a giant legal framework that's going to require lawyers in abundance to understand and navigate how you build and do procurements and all of these things for a very complicated thing. And it's a computer science endeavor, because we're going to have to simulate end to end what the observatory looks like. We won't be able to test this thing fully assembled. It'll be too big. So we're going to have to test it in software. And we did that with Webb to great success, and we're going to have to do that again. So it's going to require so many different people working in concert, and in the end, it's going to be many tens of thousands of people that will in some way touch this observatory. And just as a figure of merit, there are only about 10,000 active astronomers in the United States. So when you think about, there's going to be more people being part of this observatory than they're using it, it gives you a sense of the national and international footprint.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I'm wondering, with regards to the technical readiness level, obviously there's the key questions that you and your team are currently asking, and the ones that we should care about. But is there anything on the radar screen with regards to the TRL from the NASA perspective at this point in time, or is that something that comes following the mission formulation?
No. So we understand at a pretty good level, because of the precursor work that went into having this facility recommended. We understand the TRL of all of the major subsystems fairly well. Some of them are very high heritage, because we now know how to deploy complicated space observatories. We have a TRL 9 deployed segmented aperture in space. It's called the James Webb Space Telescope. But the level of stability of Webb is about a factor of 1,000. It was never designed to be as stable as Habitable will be. So the TRL of that ultra stability is in the mid 4s to 5s, if you know the TRL scale. So there's a lot to be matured on the technology side, because we're going to need certain components of this to be TRL6 by a certain phase in the mission formulation, and we're not yet there with most of those subsystems. But that's precisely the work that we're doing in parallel to the team that I'm co-leading. There is another team called the Technical Analysis Group, which is writing down the roadmaps to bring all these components to TRL6 and beyond. So that's the key piece of planning that we're doing right now, so that when it becomes an official project and real resources, when resources are being put into this now, but hundreds of millions of dollar resources to advance those technologies, that's not started yet. And we want to do our homework as good as possible so that we don't redefine the mission in multiple ways along as it proceeds. And that, because that will make it costlier and that will make it take longer. And we want to learn the lessons from previous flagships like Webb and others, so that we can get this thing launched on budget, on schedule, and doing great science.
And another point, as you were describing this, to me, is the operation, right? You alluded to that earlier regarding, operating this for a long period of time at L2. And I think that's really a game changer, right? How we, basically think of these telescopes to be, a finite timeline where we can use them, and then they basically become defunct. And now going from that and see how can we service this in orbit. And I just find that it's just opens up a whole new world of space operations and logistics. And of course, as you mentioned, with the way we can now get to orbit, faster and less expensive than before, it just really, really interesting to see what really unfolds at the point for launch for this specific endeavor.
Yeah, we've learned a lot from Hubble. Hubble will turn 34 in April, right? It's been operating for 34 years in low Earth orbit. And that's only been possible because of servicing, right? 5 servicing missions to the observatory. And so we've learned a lot from that. And I think we would be unwise with habitable worlds not to design and build towards at least that lifetime, right? We have minimum lifetime requirements, and we can write down the sort of minimum viable set of scientific questions to answer to call the mission a success. But if we do this right, and I have every faith that we do, this could be a telescope that operates for half a century. And when we think about the technology that's going to be available 20 years after this launches, that's kind of scary and fascinating at some level, right? When Hubble launched, it had mid-'80s technology in it, right? Some of the components dated from the late 70s, and they're still in operations now, right? The imaging detectors, the electronics, the communications, all of that on Hubble is exceedingly old. And when Webb was launched, most of its components were 10-ish years old. So when HabWorlds launches, it's going to have somewhat dated technology, but to the extent where you can continuously upgrade the instrumentation, that's when you bring new technology to bear. And that's when, the technology we operate in 2060 on HabWorlds is going to make the technology that we were considering in 2024 just look silly.
Yes, definitely. And it's really hard to wrap your head around that, because as you pointed out, the pace in which technology evolves on a daily basis is just, it's almost unpredictable what the capabilities we have in the future. But I think it's just fascinating to see how we can do this. And I'm really, really happy that you pointed to such a really important and much needed effort for us to discover more about our universe, and surely the habitable worlds out there, or planets if they exist, which is very likely. We have arrived at a point, Dr. O'Mara, where I like to learn a little bit more about your day-to-day work as a chief scientist and deputy director at an observatory. I think you have one of the coolest jobs, and it's just really interesting to me to learn the type of work weeks you have and the different functions you play in. Obviously, you shared a little bit about those roles with us, but any details you can
Mhm.
share would be much appreciated.
So there's two components. What's the life of a chief scientist like? I view my job as the chief scientist is to be a translator, as to be a connector of things. So our observatory has, of course, our astronomers, our astronomical community, which uses the facility. But we also have a community of instrument builders that build the next generation of instruments. We also have the federal agencies which help fund the instrumentation, or in the case of NASA, which is a 1/6 operating partner in the observatory. We have a board of directors. We have a philanthropic community that helps resource the observatory. And so my job on a day-to-day level is to translate from one of those worlds into another world, right? What does the instrumentation community need from the federal funding agencies? What do I need to do to speak to our donor base to have them give to the observatory so that we can build that instrumentation? How do we communicate our successes and challenges to our board of directors? That's my job, is to interconnect those things. Not usually to do all the work. You don't want me doing some of that work, but it's to connect the right people in the right room at the right time, and to act as that translation layer also for our public outreach and to disseminate the news of our discoveries. And so I spend a lot of time on airplanes. When you live in Hawaii, it's about 6 hours to have a handshake with anybody. And also I work very closely with our fund development community to get some of the resources that we need. So yeah, I spend a lot of time on airplanes. It's always seat 7F on the United Airlines 737. They might as well just laminate a little name tag on there for me. But it's also a very fun job because I get to touch every aspect of the observatory. I get to understand, at some level, the engineering, the science, the software, the financial systems, and all that, because I have to be able to communicate to all those pieces. So I get kind of a 30,000 and sometimes a 5,000, and on rare occasions a 50-foot look at every aspect of the observatory. And then on the deputy director side, my day-to-day role there is to implement our policies to make sure that our nighttime operations are successful, to understand, if there's an issue that arises during the night, how quickly did we respond to it? At some level, we're fundamentally a service industry, right? We provide the telescope,
Yes.
the instrumentation. And so, if there's an issue, how quickly are we responding to it? We have a very, very deep sense of pride in our uptime and in our relationship with our community. And so I've got to manage that aspect of it and manage most of the aspects of the nighttime operations. Again, I'm not physically pushing metal or writing code. You don't want me doing either of those things, but I'm leading up the teams that do that. And as you said before, I have a really awesome job. I mean, I get to go around the world and talk about the observatory, talk about its science, get to think about future space telescopes, and get to work with really amazing people all over the planet, right? Because our astronomical community is international, but also the larger NASA world, the Science Foundation world, the federal relations. I like spending time on Capitol Hill advocating for more money for science. I'm extremely lucky in that I've managed to make my way to a career that lets me do all of these things.
Yeah, it's amazing, and you and I met at a space conference, so this is, that outreach definitely is noteworthy, and it's really cool to see that you, with the background that you have, that you get a chance to just advocate for more and more for the science community. So that's great to see, and on that point, I like to see if there are any career tips that you have for somebody who's either in the field right now, the broader aerospace field, or a student or an intern who's possibly thinking of joining the aerospace industry or the space industry overall. Is there anything that you can share with regards to your own background and, of course, the you have wore many different hats throughout the years. So anything you can share with those individuals?
Yeah, I think the first and most important tip that I'll give, and the one that has been sort of a guiding principle for me, is find really smart people and work with them. And it doesn't even matter what you're working on with them, because you will find inspiration in what they do. You will build a network of really capable people, and never close your eyes and say, there aren't smart people there, or there isn't opportunity there. Every aspect of my career success has been because I've worked with a lot of really, really good people, and we've lifted each other up, right? That we've not made it about our individual career aspirations only. Instead, we've worked as teams, and this has been either scientifically or in advocacy or in communications or in mission development. So my recommendation to the early career folks is get involved in as many things as you can. Don't burn yourself out, and don't throw yourself 100% at any one thing, but get involved in lots of things and expose yourself to a lot of communities. Because one day you may find yourself wanting to do some aspect of that in a very deep and profound way. I found this a lot when working in Washington, D.C. People ask, well, how do you get FaceTime in front of a senator? The answer, and here's the secret, is you go twice. The first time they don't know who you are. The second time they start to recognize you. And it's just engagement and engagement and engagement. This can be difficult depending on your personality type and all that. So find the way that works best for you. But really just building up a network of really talented, diverse, intelligent people has been the secret to my success, however large or small that might be. It's really been because I've been part of a wonderful community of folks, and just engaging in that community and giving to that community, paying it forward as frequently as you can, always works out well. And to be honest, luck, right? That's why you go to conferences and meet interesting people who then ask you to be on podcasts later. That's luck. It's a little bit engineered luck, but it's still luck. And so, embrace that sometimes the universe wants to throw fun things at you, and you'll do well.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Amir. And I want to just say that, I'm very delighted that you talked about the team aspect, because more than often when I speak to individuals in the space community, especially those in their early careers, they think they need to know it all and they should have done it all. And because they haven't got to that point, and it's, definitely understood because they're just early in their careers, that they can get ahead farther than they are at that point. And I think what you highlighted, this sense of community and teamwork, and being willing to not, being the driver all the time, but just be a participant on teams, and just leveraging the skills of others, and of course, bring your own skills to the table as well. But I think that individualistic perspective disappears rather quickly in projects and programs that you describe. And for the larger missions we have all seen, James Webb Space Telescope, it's not just one person, doing that. So thank you for pointing that out. And I'd like to thank you again very much for joining us here at Space Talk. And it's been a pleasure talking to you and learning about the exciting projects and endeavors you're part of. And it was really fun for me to hear that there's so much more fun stuff coming in the future.
Well, Amir, I really thank you for the opportunity and for giving me a chance to talk about habitable worlds and so many other things. And I look forward to running into you again at another conference sometime in the near future. But thanks for giving me the platform, and happy 2024.